Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening and welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C.'s Distinguished Speaker presentation with Dr. Alan Murray, President of the Pew Research Center here in Washington, D.C. I'm Heidi Shoup, and on behalf of the board and members of the World Affairs Council, it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. This program is being recorded for broadcast on our weekly program, World Affairs Today, so I will ask, as always, that you mute your phones as a courtesy to our speaker and to our audience here and at home. We invite you to tweet along with tonight's program by using the hashtag WACDC Live. In June 2014, a Pew Research Center published a poll highlighting the increasing political polarization of the American public. The news item I saw at the time reported that Republicans and Democrats were more divided along ideological lines. Partisan antipathy was deeper and more extensive than at any point in the last 2 decades. The survey found that these divisions were greatest among those who were most engaged and active in the political process. In addition, a Pew-Council on Foreign Relations study at about the same time showed an increase in the public inclination toward minding our own business internationally. This raised 2 questions in my mind. First, have there been times prior to 1994 when the medians were this far apart? And what were or are the implications for or effects on America's foreign policy approach, our way of engaging or not with the international community? Pew Research Center is a nonpartisan fact tank that informs us about the issues, attitudes, and trends shaping America and the world. Using opinion polling, demographic research, and other empirical tools, Pew Research tracks and highlights key trends that are shaping the fast-changing world. Alan Murray is the president of Pew Research, and we are privileged to have him with us this evening to discuss the poll in question, along with the foreign policy implications. In so doing, I have no doubt he will help us understand how much we can learn from polling and other research activities carried on by Pew and other organizations. Prior to joining Pew in 2012, Mr. Murray worked at the Wall Street Journal, where he most recently served as deputy managing editor and executive editor online, and spent a decade as the journal's Washington bureau chief, during which time the bureau won 3 Pulitzer Prizes. He subsequently served as CNBC's Washington bureau chief, co-hosting Capitol Report with Alan Murray and Gloria Berger. He is the author of 4 books, including Showdown at Gucci Gulch, The Story of the Tax Reform Act of 1986, the single most sweeping change in the history of America's income tax. We are really pleased to have him with us this evening, and with that, I will turn it over to you. Alan?
Well, thank you very much, Heidi. It's a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to walk you through some of this data, which I think you will find very interesting. You only have to pick up the paper these days to recognize what a significant moment this is for the United States and foreign policy. If you look at what's happening in the Ukraine and with Putin, if you look at what's happening in the Middle East. And I think if you read it a little more closely, you also recognize the incredibly important role that the United States plays in world events. It's an interesting thought experiment to think about if we had responded differently to the challenge in Syria. Might we have prevented the spread of ISIS into Iraq? Might we have discouraged Putin from being as aggressive as he was in the Ukraine, and might it have had other effects on how world affairs are playing out? We just came out recently with a poll that looked at the high levels of concern in Asia, in Vietnam, in Korea, in Japan, with the maneuverings of China in the South China Sea. Over 80% of the publics in each of those countries expressed a great deal of concern. One wonders how that's going to play out. So we are at an interesting moment for the world. We are at a uncertain moment for America's leadership in the world, and behind that, I think, are the opinions of the American public, and that's what I want to spend a few minutes talking about tonight, show you what our research shows, and then open it up to have a discussion about what the implications of this are. See if I can work the technology here. So first of all, as these numbers show you, the American public the American public's view of American power in the world is at a 40-year low. These are questions we've been asking since 1974. And for the first time, you have a majority of Americans saying that the U.S. plays a less important and powerful role than it did 10 years ago. It's a pretty striking finding. Equally striking is this one, a sense that the U.S. should mind its own business internationally and let other countries get along as best as they can on their own. Now, I want to make a confession to you here, and we can talk about this more later on. I hate this question. Look at it for a while and try and figure out exactly what does it mean when you say mind your own business. So why do we keep asking it? Well, we keep asking it because we've been asking it for half a century, and the only way you can get a trend on it is to ask the same question. So I can't vouch for exactly what it's telling you, but it's telling you something. It's telling you that we are that American public opinion is at a striking moment where people are feeling a desire to pull away from the world more than they have at any time in the recent past. This one's similar. The U.S. public, when asked, we should not think so much in international terms, but concentrate on our own national problems and build up our own strengths and prosperity at home. 80% now agree. That's the highest that we've seen in any of the polls we've taken since 1960. So there's something very real going on out there, and the desire of the American public to pull back from foreign affairs around the world. Interesting thing about it, though, is that it's not reflected in economic views. In terms of the opinion towards global trade, 77% say growing trade and business ties between the U.S. and the rest of the world are a good thing. As you can see, that's roughly where it was in 2002. It dipped some for a while around the time of the recession, but has held up reasonably well. So it's not a protectionist sentiment that we're seeing, and it's not quite an isolationist sentiment, but it is a bit of weariness with America's activity in the world. Here's another question on the economic front. 2/3 of the people we talked to said that a greater U.S. involvement in the global economy, as distinct from foreign policy, is a good thing because it exposes the U.S. to new markets and opportunities for growth. The other interesting finding is that you still have majorities who say they would like the U.S. To be the world's only military superpower. And as you can see, the partisan split on this particular question is not particularly strong. I'll show you some questions in a little bit where the partisan split is much, much stronger than that. 50% of Democrats agree it would be best if the U.S. was the only military superpower in the world. We asked people what they think the top policy priorities should be. We let them pick a couple, and this is the result. Terrorism ranks very high, but jobs is second on the list. Weapons of mass destruction is up there, energy independence is up there, and then it starts to fall off. To me, the most striking thing about this list is the notion of promoting democracy around the world, which is something that we've heard a lot about over the last decade, is at the rock bottom place in the list. Only 18% of the people we talked to said that that should be a priority of U.S. foreign policy. Now I want to talk a little bit about political polarization, and then we'll look at how political polarization connects to people's views on foreign policy. And this is the key point to be made here. Looking over the course of the last 2 decades, the gap between Republicans and Democrats, active Republican Democrats, has gotten much greater. But the other thing you'll see in these charts is that the wings, the people who are on the extremes, the people who are consistently liberal or consistently conservative, are much, much fatter than they were 20 years from now. Both sides have basically doubled in size. So you have a much more ideologically divided American public than you've had in the past. The majority of Americans still fall somewhere in the center, but the wings are much bigger than they have been any time in recent history. And that effect is magnified by the fact that it's those consistent liberals and those consistent conservatives who are most active in the political process. So the chart on the left here is people who always vote. Consistent liberals and consistent conservatives, as you can see, are much more likely to always vote and vote in primaries than the people in the middle. Those bars, by the way, this is sort of a 20-point scale on political views. It's based on a set of questions, about 20 questions that we've been asking for decades that enable us. And the questions are not what party do you belong to, but how do you feel about the role of government? How do you feel about the social safety net? How do you feel about immigration, that enable us to track people's views over time? And what you see is that the people who are most ideological and most ideologically consistent are the ones who are most likely to get out there and vote. And then in the chart on the right, you see they're also the people who are most likely to make campaign contributions. So they're even though they are still a minority of the public overall, the polarized parts of both parties are a much bigger minority than they were 20 years ago, and they have an outsized influence on the political process because they consistently vote, consistently make campaign contributions, are much more likely to turn out at political events or call their member of Congress. Now, this is a question we asked where we said, look, if when Barack Obama and the Republican leaders get together to address a major issue, how do you think they should resolve their disagreements? And the fascinating thing to me was, we said you can pick anything from 0 to 100, where 0 is Barack Obama gets everything he wants, 100 is the Republicans get everything they want, and any number in between is what it is. Majority of Americans, when faced with that question, gave the answer 50. Said 50-50, split it 50-50. That was the gut instinct of the majority of people who we talked to on this. But again, if you look at the people who are consistently liberal or consistently conservative, that's not the way they view it. And again, those are the people who are having the most influence on the political process. They're the ones who have an outsized effect on the debate. So one of the things we did in this poll that Heidi was discussing earlier was we took, it was a poll of 10,000 Americans, a random sample across the country, and we asked them a bunch of questions about their political views, and then we did a cluster analysis to sort of figure out how those views lined up. And it identified these, and this analysis was not done based on party identification. It was done based on answers to a series of questions about politically sensitive topics, like the role of government, the social safety net, the support for business, support for immigration, et cetera. We divided them into the cluster analysis, kicked them out into the 8 groups you see here, and it was a pretty interesting result. What you saw was, first of all, you had this group called steadfast conservatives who consistently agreed with the conservative line across a host of issues. Then there was a group that we call business conservatives that were very strongly conservative on the small government issues, but took a completely different approach on things like immigration, much more pro-immigration, much softer on a lot of the social issues. And that was a striking finding in terms of the divide in the Republican Party. You really have two very different groups of conservatives that agree on some things, like restricting the size of government and keeping taxes down, but then disagree pretty strongly on some other issues like immigration. And then there was the group of solid liberals, the ones that could be counted on across the board to support Democrats and Democratic policies. And you'll see those three groups, which we call the partisan anchors, make up about 37% of the public total. Those are the consistent ideological parts of the public. Then you have these other four groups that are an interesting mix. The young outsiders were sort of libertarian, but not libertarian on some issues like the environment. They wanted strong government action on the environment. They definitely, you'll see in a minute, that they were libertarian on foreign policy and other issues. They were much younger than the other groups. So sort of a younger, conservative, Republican leaning, but not consistently Republican. Hard-pressed skeptics, people who were tended to be older, financially distressed, but wanted help from the government. They were angry about government, unhappy with government, but they wanted government programs to be there to help them. The next generation left was the sort of young coastal liberal, largely liberals, but didn't have the same feelings that the solid liberals had about things like the social safety net. A little more skeptical about the efficacy of government social programs. And then you have the faith and family left. This is a very racially diverse group. It includes a lot of Hispanics, for instance, who lean towards the Democratic Party and yet on some social issues tend to be more aligned with Republicans. So what you see is in those groups, 54% of the public, a much more complicated mix of views, not consistently partisan. And then the 10% we call bystanders, who are basically not particularly interested in any of the questions we asked on political issues. They just are off in their own world doing something else. Now, the reason I'm showing you all this is because what I'll show you in the next few slides is how each of these groups' views of foreign policy break down. So it's important to keep these groups in mind. Okay, so first of all, the question about U.S. involvement in the world. Should we be active in world affairs or pay less attention overseas and focus more on the home front? And here you see something very interesting. Among the solid liberals, 55% say active in world affairs, a very strong result, stronger than any group we polled except the business conservatives, where you got 67%. And you see, again, one of the fissures on the Republican side of the aisle right there, and the vast difference on this question between business conservatives and steadfast conservatives. So the business conservatives want to be engaged in world affairs. They have more of an economic focus. Steadfast conservatives want out, and in a very strong way. And of course, in that sense, they're allied with the hard-pressed skeptics and the young outsiders as well. And this is where a lot of the sort of isolationist sentiment is coming from. Do U.S. efforts in the world usually make things worse, or would problems be worse without the U.S.? Is the U.S. the indispensable nation? Again, the business conservatives are the strongest on this point. Yes, the world needs the U.S. to be involved. The steadfast conservatives and the skeptics and the young outsiders say, stay out, and U.S. involvement usually makes things worse. What's the best way to ensure peace? Military strength or good diplomacy? Here you see alignment on the conservative side. Both the steadfast conservatives and the business conservatives are in favor of military strength, and almost no one else. After that, there's it tilts towards diplomacy. When you get to the solid liberals, it's 91% picked diplomacy and only 5% picked military strength. So pretty stark difference. By the way, I would urge you all, I'm sorry we can't do it here, but I would urge you all tonight to, or tomorrow, to go to our website at pewresearch.org, where you can take the poll yourself and find out which category you fall into, which I think will be helpful for you to get a sense of what these statistics mean. Democratic groups differ over the use of overwhelming force against terrorism. Is overwhelming force the best way to defeat terrorism, or does too much force create hatred and more terror? Once again, it's the conservatives who are strongest on using force. But an interesting thing pops up here, the faith and family left. That's the more racially diverse group, a lot of Hispanics in that group, much more open to the use of force to defeat terrorism. And you see a sharp split between them and the solid liberals, where 88% say too much force creates hatred and more terror, and only 8% are strongly supportive of the use of force as the best way to defeat terrorism. Now, interestingly, on the question of NSA data collection, you don't see a strong partisan split. The numbers are pretty similar across all the groups. There's a little more disapproval among the steadfast conservatives and the solid liberals, so the more ideologically involved are both more likely to oppose, and a little more acceptance among those who are less engaged in the political process. Are you willing to give up privacy for safety from terrorism, or do you feel the public should not have to give up privacy for safety from terrorism? And again, you see it's pretty consistent on these questions of privacy in the NSA. You don't yet see strong partisan differences. Free trade agreements, bad for the U.S., good for the U.S. There's the split on the Republican side again, where the business conservatives, 68% say good for the U.S., but among the steadfast conservatives, 51% say bad for the U.S. Interestingly, the liberals on this question are pretty strongly positive. The hard-pressed skeptics, who are a lower economic group, many of them have had troubles, may well feel displaced by trade, less supportive. And then in terms of an economic policy towards China, should we get tougher with China, or should we build a stronger relationship with China? Steadfast conservatives come out at the top in believing we should get tougher, and then it sort of follows the ideological spread down to where the solid liberals favor relationship building. Nothing too surprising there. Okay, let's look at some recent examples in foreign policy and how they've broken down. Dispute between Israel and the Palestinians, who do you sympathize with more? And here you see that Republicans are much more likely to sympathize with Israel, 73%. This is one of the more interesting things going on in American politics today. Conservative evangelicals have a strong support for Israel and feel a strong affinity in general. We have other research showing they feel a strong affinity in general with the Jewish people that it isn't always reciprocated by Jews in America. So it's an interesting dynamic. And we found in our research that some of these people who have these strong feelings about Israel and strong feelings about Jews live in places where there are very few Jews, may well not have any exposure to Jews, but they have a strong emotional attachment because of the religious heritage. Public views of action in the Ukraine. Do you favor increasing economic diplomatic sanctions on Russia? This is obviously before the most recent events, but after the takeover of Crimea, 53% favored, 36% opposed. Sending arms, military supplies to the Ukrainian government, 62% opposed. So sanctions, yes, but military supplies, no. And here's the partisan breakdown. Not terribly dramatic, not a huge difference between Republicans and Democrats on this issue. Here's another one where the difference is really not that big. Do you think religious rivalries have contributed a lot to violence in Iraq? Is Islam more likely to encourage violence? There is a split on this question. Republicans, 60% say yes. Democrats, only 35% say yes. So you do start to see some divergence there. So I think what you've seen in those, and we're trying to get a better handle in some of our future research of how do these ideas develop. I mean, sometimes there are issues that are not terribly polarizing for the public at first, but as the conversation goes on and as political leaders take stronger stances, you begin to see the public become more polarized. And I think you can get a sense from those numbers I just showed you that on some issues you have Republicans and Democrats dividing very sharply, and on others it's still a little bit fuzzy. Trying to understand that dynamic, what's driving it, what's the role that media plays in it, what's the role that campaign contributions and paid media plays into it is part of what we're going to be working on through the rest of the year. Okay, now I want to show you some data from our global polling. We were in 45 countries this year, so this is a pretty good cross-section of large countries around the world. I think it represents something like 85% of the world's population. First of all, how do you feel about the NSA actions? And the question is U.S. monitoring of citizens from your own country acceptable or unacceptable? 81% say unacceptable. How about leaders of your own country? NSA monitoring of leaders, acceptable or unacceptable? 73% across a number of countries say it's unacceptable. How about NSA monitoring of American citizens? 62% say unacceptable. It's only when you get to terrorist suspects that a majority are willing to accept it. And then on the other side of the dotted line, what you see is in these same countries, favorable or unfavorable views of the U.S. 65% still have a favorable view of the U.S. So in spite of the fact that they're unhappy with NSA spying, it hasn't changed their largely favorable view of the United States. We asked people which country they see as currently as the top economic power, and then do they think China will eventually replace the U.S. as the top superpower. And you see 49% think that China will eventually or has already replaced the U.S., but only 29% think today that China has replaced the U.S. And we can talk a little bit about the regional breakdowns in this. It's very interesting to look at different parts of the world and how favorable views of the U.S. and China balance off against each other. Obviously, in the Middle East right now, China is viewed much more favorably than the U.S. But you go into Latin America and it's a mix. In certain countries, in Brazil, very positive feelings towards the U.S., but in Argentina, much more positive feelings towards China. You see the same kind of dichotomies in Africa. Countries like Kenya and Tanzania, strong positive feelings towards the U.S., but in other countries that have benefited from Chinese aid, stronger positive feelings towards China. Here you see a list of the countries that are most favorable to the U.S. and least favorable to the U.S. Not surprisingly, the Middle Eastern countries top the list of countries that have unfavorable views towards the U.S. Russia is up there fairly high as well. Greece, and Germany. A lot of what's going on there in Germany, we think, is a result of the very negative reaction in Germany to NSA spying. So that might be one country where you actually have seen some movement in the poll numbers because of that. On the other hand, positive views towards the U.S. in the Philippines, Israel, South Korea, Kenya, El Salvador, Italy, Ghana, Vietnam, Tanzania, and France. The difference between France and Germany is striking. So that gives you a taste of our data. There's a lot more on the website, and I'm happy to talk about some of the questions here or some of the other research we've been doing. But why don't I just open it up and take your questions?
It's a great presentation, very interesting. And I'm particularly curious about any qualitative research behind some of the terminology or the key terms that you are using. My own interest was piqued where I saw a commercial one time talking about the word freedom, or just using the word freedom, and the person was saying, I'm finally free from worry. I'm free. There's government programs that are going to help me. I'm free. And when I talked to a conservative friend of mine, I said, how do you understand freedom? And she said, well, it's freedom from government, freedom from regulation. I said, have you ever thought about a different way of looking at that word? And she was shocked. Same word, totally
Dramatically different
understanding.
meanings. Yeah, it's a really good point. And look, one of the things we know about public opinion polling is that changes in the wording of the question can lead to dramatically different results. And so what we try to do at the Pew Research Center is make sure that we are asking the questions in the most neutral way possible. You'll see other polls from groups. You know, we have no horse in the fight. We have no axis to grind. We don't get involved in policy. We don't get involved in partisan politics. And so we're strongly, strongly committed to making sure we do this in the most neutral way possible. But you'll often see our numbers seeming to disagree with people who do have a dog in the fight or have a particular axe to grind, and you'll see big differences. And partly it's because of that difficulty of phrasing and the emotional connection people have with words. So yeah, I think it's a complicated problem for understanding public opinion. Yes, sir.
At the very beginning, you mentioned about U.S. minding its own business, and you said that your organization is still trying to understand what does it mean. And in the next slide, you did mention something about minding its own problems. So there is a distinction between own problems versus foreign problems. So
Right.
have you guys done any research where you have tried to connect the dots quantitatively with the domestic problems, such as, for example, violence or any racial discrimination, sexist discrimination, that kind of problems, and then correlate them quantitatively with the
So we haven't done any of those correlations ourselves, but I think you see in the question where we ask people what they think the most important foreign policy issues are, and number 2 on the list was jobs. We see that, for instance, move in relation to the economy. We know that a weak economy causes people to prioritize domestic issues, domestic economic issues in particular, more highly. And so I think the slowdown that happened in 2008 is definitely part of what's causing this sense that people have that they want to pull back. But the fact that that sense is the highest it's been in 50 years in our polling means there's more than just that going on. Some of it is probably also war weariness. It's hard to know all the things that feed into it. But what's clear from these polling numbers is there is some sort of a sense of a desire to withdraw from the world that is greater today than it's been in any time in the last 50 years.
Did you try to go into the granularity of the domestic problems? Jobs is just one of them, but there are so many other problems. Means I'm trying to understand if the reason behind this particular sentiment that minding our own business, is it so that Americans are getting more wary of their own problems rather than with the outside meddling? So that's what I'm trying to understand.
Right, and we probably don't have the data that gives the degree of granularity you would like, but our sense from the data we do have is that it's both.
You talked a bit about how you were looking at other countries or other people's favorability towards the U.S. How do you distinguish between their favorability of American people and American government? Because my personal experience shows that that's widely different, with favorability of Hollywood and U.S. people, and they don't like the NSA, they don't like the U.S. government and their policies.
Yeah, so if you go on our website, we've tried to get at some of those distinctions. We certainly ask about the president and how they feel about the president per se. We've also, in not so much this year, but in our poll last spring, we ask a series of questions about how do you feel about American culture, how do you feel about American business practices, how do you feel about American support for individual freedoms, and you do see differences depending on which of those questions you're asking. On the one that I showed here, we were just trying to get sort of a broad sense of how people feel about the United States. And obviously different people will come to that question with different thoughts and different baggage.
The data you see shifting towards like a more, non-interventionist mindset for the political, public. Do you see that as a permanent like shift in political landscape, or do you think it's a temporary shift?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. Another way of thinking about that question is, what would it take? What kind of an event overseas, what sort of overreach by Mr. Putin might cause the American public to change their views and say, oh, well, wait a minute, this means, and you do see that ambiguity in the support, in the belief that the U.S. should remain the world's only military superpower. At the same time, people are saying they want to withdraw from the world. So I think I don't think it moves overnight. And I think the fact that we are at a 50-year high on those trends means there's something going on that's qualitatively different from the past. But I don't think there's any question that events can shape that. The obvious example, of course, is 9/11. You saw a dramatic move, if you go back to those charts, a dramatic move after 9/11 on some of those questions. So a big event, a big threat, some sort of Chinese acting out in the South China Sea could cause significant changes in public opinion.
All right, thank you.
In the issue-by-issue breakdown that you had research on, there's obviously a very large difference within the Republican Party, like two very clear lines on certain issues. I was asking if you had any research or just a personal opinion about why that exists, more so within the conservative camp than in the liberal camp, which seems to be staying fairly united.
Yeah, so I think what our cluster analysis of the research showed is that there really are two very distinct camps that make up the core of the Republican Party. And one is this sort of hardcore social and economic conservative core. The other is a much more business-oriented group that shares the anti-government views of the conservative core, but is much more feels much less strongly about a lot of the social issues, much more open to engagement in the world on the trade front, much more open to things like immigration. I think it's a pretty serious rift in the Republican Party, and you see it playing out in things like the debate over the Ex-Im Bank that's going on right now. You can see it playing out on Capitol Hill as well. Interestingly, there's a tendency to think of that steadfast conservative group as the Tea Party group, but when we asked people, how do you feel about the Tea Party, the levels of favorability were about the same. It was around 50%, both among the steadfast conservatives and among the business conservatives. So roughly equal levels of support for the Tea Party. And I think some of that is that the Tea Party is an amorphous enough idea that it means different things to different people, but I also think the core of the Tea Party has really been the controlling the size of government, and that's where the two groups are in sync. Now, if you look at the other side, on the Democratic side, yes, we only put that one group, the kind of solid liberals, in the partisan camp. But the solid liberals can't win an election without the support of some of the other groups, particularly the group we called the faith and family left. And there you see the beginnings of the rift in the Democratic Party, particularly on some of the social issues, where the religious Hispanics, for instance, may feel less comfortable with some of the things that the hardcore liberals are supporting. So there are splits on both sides.
Thank you.
Good evening, sir. We took a look at tonight at a lot of the countries that had a favorable, unfavorable impression of the United States. I was wondering if Pew had looked deeper into the question on what factors or what policies really drew that reaction, and if there was to be a change in course by the U.S. government, would that change their view subsequently of a Greek citizen, a German citizen, perhaps?
Right. So you see, as I mentioned, we know that favorability rates in Germany towards the U.S. have declined in the wake of the NSA scandal. So you see an effect there. We've been asking questions for the last couple of years about how people feel about the use of drones, and some pretty negative rates there that may be affecting things. But it's really hard to disaggregate all that's going on in people's general views towards the United States. So we have, if you look on our website, you'll see some specific examples, and I've given a couple here. And by the way, it's often difficult for people themselves to understand what's driving their positive and negative feelings about people, about countries. And that's one of the challenges of polling. I mean, to get people to be articulate about why they feel the way they feel.
In your presentation, you divided the two parties that we have into multiple different factions. But do you think that having a multi-party system in the U.S. would be beneficial, because those factions did differ even within steadfast conservatives versus business conservatives?
Well, that's actually one of the things we were trying to look at in the research. So if you have these, the polls are clearly bigger than they used to be, and yet the majority of people say, geez, can't we just split the difference, come up with 50-50 solutions, want them to compromise on issues that really matter to the American people. And so has that great center of the population been somehow disenfranchised because the people at the polls are the ones who do all the voting and primaries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And so we were trying to, and we're going to do some follow-up research to try and understand what might it take to get the center engaged. Is there a third party option? Is there something that could be done to get those people engaged? And we've spent some time thinking about and looking at the third party option. The problem is, if you look at those four groups I described that aren't on the wings, they're very diverse. They have very different notions themselves. And so the idea of a single candidate, a kind of a Ross Perot or a single set of issues that would somehow unite them is almost hard to imagine. One of the interesting things to me about watching Rand Paul run his campaign is he has particular issues. In fact, if you look at those 8 groups, you could probably find one Rand Paul issue that appeals to each group. But the question is anybody going to buy the whole package? And that's the challenge. So how you unite that kind of disparate, diverse group of people who aren't on the wings into a political movement is a big challenge.
As I was listening to your presentation and looking at the slides, I was thinking about how useful this is for citizens in the society sort of understand the various views that make us up. But another question that I couldn't really answer was, how do the results get used? Do policymakers take these into account in making policy? Do politicians take these results into account in deciding which voter groups to attack? And do you get any sense at Pew, or maybe even from your own research or experience as a journalist, as to how these things are used and influence policymaking?
Well, we're a nonprofit organization. We're interested in both channels of influence, right? We would like to inform people broadly, and hopefully in the process have we believe in the power of information and the power of information to lead to better policy and to make the world a better place. So we think that by informing people broadly that we can have a positive effect. We also hope that our information is used by policymakers. We try and make sure that policymakers have access to it. But I have to say, our experience and our gut, which is different than most of the think tanks in this town, is that the best way to get to the policymakers is through the public, or at least the informed public. The people who are reading, watching elite media. So our hope is something like this. Cluster analysis of the electorate can have a positive effect. If people start to see that, hey, the country is not just filled with the people I see on MSNBC and on Fox, that there are a lot of people who have a much more complicated set of views. That in and of itself can have an effect in reducing polarization. So we're working very hard to get as many people as we possibly can to take this quiz, understand where they fall, and to see where others fall. I think the last time I checked, we were up to about 500,000, but we're putting out in the next couple of weeks a community version of the quiz so that clubs, school classrooms, any group that wants to do a group version of the quiz and see where they as a group fit into the electorate can do that.
When we looked at the election of Obama, we found that younger people overwhelmingly supported Obama, who was much more of an internationalist compared to George Bush. And his internationalism was much more, as you said, commerce, economics, not so much military involvement. Have you looked at your data in terms of generational differences?
Yeah, we have. We've done a lot of work on generational differences, and there are some pretty stark differences in some areas that you've already hinted at. Issues like immigration, issues like gay marriage, obviously, and in some of the foreign policy issues as well. I mean, the younger generation tends to be much more diverse, multiracial, much more open to international engagement, all the things that you might expect. One of the questions we can't answer is, will those views travel with them throughout their life? But certainly they are starting their adult life with a very different approach to the world. And that's a challenge to both parties. The two groups in our typology that represent that are the ones we call the next generation Democrats and the ones we call the young outsiders. The two groups are different in the fact that the young outsiders tend to be relatively anti-government and the next generation Democrats tend to be relatively pro-government, but they're similar in their tolerant attitudes towards immigration and towards relations with the rest of the world.
Yeah, just to follow up, traditionally after military involvement, there's always been this withdrawal, this kind of neo-isolationism, whatever you want to call it. Of course, Bush, when he went into office, withdrew from many international involvements, the Kyoto Accords, the World Criminal Court, and so forth. But then we got hit with 9/11. Given what you just said about the younger generation who overwhelmingly support Obama, does this suggest that maybe this pattern may be changing, that maybe we might not go through a withdrawal pattern after the current situation?
It's an interesting thesis. I don't think there's anything I haven't seen anything in our data that would answer the question.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Just first off, thanks so much for the presentation.
Yeah.
I guess just with your experience being a reporter and in the press and then now being at Pew, how do you see the role of media and reporters polling polarization further, and also in the same way polling opinions of American foreign policy either way as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things we did with this poll, this was the biggest political poll we've ever done, the polarization work, a 10,000 person sample. But then at the end of the poll, we said, would you be willing to sign up for additional online polls? And we got about half of the people, so about 5,000 people, to agree to do follow-on polling. So they are now part of an online panel. We call it the American Trends Panel. And the first poll we did going back at them was on exactly that question. Where are you getting information? What kind of media are you relying on? Who do you trust in the media? And of course, one of the things you see in that is this very strong polarization of media sources. There are two exceptions that I'll tell you about in a minute, but almost any main media you can think of will have strong support on one side and little support on the other side. So, Fox is obvious on the right, MSNBC is obvious on the left, NPR, New York Times considered, I'm not saying that they are or that this is the way they're run, but in terms of the audience perception, they're considered very much creatures of the left. And so you see an overall decline in trust in media, but more significantly, you see this sharp polarization in media. And we do get a little support for the notion that people are increasingly living in media bubbles. They're getting information that reinforces their views. And of course, technology is reinforcing this. People who get most of their news from Facebook or from Google, both of which use personalization algorithms that tend to feed you the kind of stuff that you've already shown them you like. And so all of these forces are, I think, in some ways reinforcing polarization. I don't know what you do about that. The technology piece of it might be fixable, but an awful lot of it is just a matter of consumer choice. People have many more choices in the media they consume today than they did 20 or 30 years ago, and so if they want to just read stuff that reconfirms their biases, they can.
I believe you've already touched a little bit on the subject, but I thought it would be interesting are there any other groupings that you've studied, perhaps maybe, for example, different socioeconomic classes, levels of education that maybe that group these different issues in ways that they correlate better?
Yeah, so we try and look at all of those. I mean, we have demographics, we have income status, obviously sex, race, and religion as well. But the interesting thing about America today is that none of those demographic differences, income, none of them are as polarizing as party identification. So to give a simple example of what I'm suggesting, I can tell your views on gun control better by knowing what party you belong to than by knowing whether or not you own a gun. It's a simple example. But partisan identification has become such a strong defining force in American society that it means much more than other divides. Well, income is a good example. That group called the Solid Liberals is actually a fairly high-income group. But so are the business conservatives, So both of those are high-income groups, but they're on completely opposite sides of the political aisle.
Good evening, sir. I just wanted to ask you about the increasing significance, or so it seems, of social media, and of course we're seeing greater penetration throughout the world, and you mentioned, of course, the increasing role of the Vox Populi. And we see more and more governments spending more and more resources on public diplomacy. Just wondering what your thoughts were as far as how you would weight the significance of social media versus other things that you mentioned, like the increase of the middle class, that type of thing.
Yeah, I don't know how to divide. I mean, obviously both of them are working together. You have people coming out of poverty, moving into the middle class, and also having access to technology that not only lets them communicate with each other, but it lets them find out what else is happening in the world. You know, so if you're sitting in Rio de Janeiro and you see these folks in Beijing who are accumulating wealth so quickly, that obviously has an effect. I mean, one of the things we're finding in our global polls is the level of expectation in the developing world is sky high. So if you ask the question, what I've always thought of as the quintessential question of middle class expectation, do you think children will live better than their parents? In the US today, only about 33% of the people who answer that question say yes. Not particularly high. In Europe, you're down in the teens, or in some cases in France, when we asked last year, it was 9%. China, who said China? 83%. Brazil, 82%. But even in some African countries like Kenya and Tanzania, you would see over 60% believe that their children are going to live better than they have. I have to think that that's connected to media, to exposure to what's going on elsewhere in the world, and it may be setting up expectations that are going to be very hard to live with. Then there's the completely separate question that we're thinking of doing some future research on, which is how does social media empower these groups once they've developed these opinions.
Alan, your data shows this coming home, if you will, sort of thing. Were you surprised that climate change got such a low priority, only 18%?
I think that's partly an effect of polarization as well. It's interesting that the United States is an outlier in the world today on the issue of climate change. There's less support for doing anything about climate change than in almost any of the other countries we've polled in, with the exception of some Middle Eastern oil-producing nations. And that's an issue that has become extremely polarized. Again, I can tell your views on climate change pretty reliably by knowing what party you belong to. And there's no other piece of information that will let me predict your views on climate change beyond that. So no, I'm not surprised, because we've been seeing this for some time. And it was exacerbated by the economic downturn, support for doing anything about climate change. I mean, remember, if you go back to 2008, you had two presidential candidates, both of whom supported putting caps on carbon emissions, or not caps, but having a cap and trade system. And so it looked like for a while, and you had a lot of the major businesses lining up in a coalition to support it, and so it almost looked like it was a done deal. And then with the economic downturn, that support pretty much disappeared, and we're now back into a situation where you have very, very partisan views and very little support on the Republican side for doing anything about climate change. Thank you. I hope that's been helpful. I appreciate being here.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.